During an earlier lecture, I already covered the basics of greenhouse effect and climate change. Just to reiterate some of the important points, I want to mention that some of the solar radiation that is emitted by the sun is reflected back by the Earth's atmosphere to a significant extent. And then whatever that completely penetrates the atmosphere, and strikes the Earth's surface, a particular fraction of that radiation, solar radiation, is also reflected back to the atmosphere, and then of course it exceeds the atmosphere. So only a substantially smaller fraction of incoming solar radiation is actually contributing to warming the Earth's surface. And when that Earth's surface is warmed up, the heated Earth radiates infrared radiation towards the atmosphere. And now there's from that re-emitted heat, in form of infrared radiation, is being absorbed by greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, water vapor, and methane, and there are several other examples of greenhouse gases. So those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will trap, will retain the re-radiated infrared. And once these greenhouse gases absorb that heat, it will actually, heat cannot be either destroyed nor created. So the heat absorbed by the greenhouse gases has to be converted into something else. Actually, that heat generates movements or motion energy in these greenhouse gases, and when the gases move around, they collide with each other, and as a result, that collision generates heat. And it's actually this particular heat generated by trapping green by trapping infrared radiation by greenhouse gases that results in an increased elevated temperature in the Earth's atmosphere, right? So this phenomena I have detailed to you is actually called greenhouse effect. Now, greenhouse effect happens normally. I did mention that without this particular natural greenhouse effect, the Earth's atmospheric temperature or Earth's sea surface temperature will be below zero. In fact, it is this particular phenomena that actually elevates Earth's surface temperature to a livable level, which actually facilitates evolution and all the other biological, physiological, biochemical reactions to sustain life on Earth. But what happens is with the increasing greenhouse gas concentrations, particularly carbon dioxide, the actual the heat retained will increase beyond the normal levels, beyond the historical levels, and that will generate extra heat retention within the atmosphere, leading to increased atmospheric temperature. Now, that is actually is the enhanced or induced greenhouse effect, which leads to climate change, right? So it's really important to understand the differences between what is natural greenhouse effect, what is enhanced greenhouse effect that comes about because of increased carbon dioxide concentrations and other greenhouse gases, and how that leads to global climate change. So like I mentioned to you before, um, I do want you to know this incident. Is it true or false? If total greenhouse gas concentration um, or the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere were to become zero, the planet would be a safe place for most life forms. Well, actually, because I gave the answer already to you, this is false, right? The Earth's atmospheric temperature will be way below sustenance of most life forms. At most, you will have very cold tolerant species, and even those might actually become dormant because if the temperature drops over 10 degrees below what it is now, um, the life, if it were to exist, will be in a suspended or a dormant form at all. So example for greenhouse gases, I already mentioned several key greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, Water vapor is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and in fact, many other pollutants, atmospheric pollutants, emitted through industrial activities, combustion of automobiles, or combustion of fossil fuel, automobile exhaustions also release greenhouse gases. And in fact, I do want you to research on your own and figure out, understand what are some other examples for greenhouse gases. So, an interesting question you can ask is this: okay, to how do we know that the climate is changing? How do we know about the history of the Earth's climate that actually happened before evolution of the humans, before industrial and scientific advancements were made? Well, kind of, you can broaden the question and ask, how do we know about the Earth's geological history? How do we know about Earth's atmosphere's history? Well, there are many ways to answer that question, many ways to study this. I'm going to kind of, quickly recap this. So some of those techniques are very simple, right? You know that if you're looking at a tree, um, or a tree trunk, if you get a cross section of a tree, right, you get to see these concentric rings called tree rings, right? So those tree rings actually indicate, each tree ring indicates a single growth season, right? And also, um, depending on the size of the tree ring, you can also predict if that particular year was a dry year or a wet year, right? For example, during rainy seasons, trees grow very well, so you will actually get a thick, very thick, prominently thick tree ring. If there was a drought, then you get actually a very smaller tree ring. If there were to be a fire, right, then of course, within the tree trunk, you get scarring, like, or evidence of, like leftover charcoals. So that's actually one simple way you can determine the status of the climate in different years. Now, you may ask the question, when you are sampling the climate based on a tree, do you always have to cut it down and kill it? Well, no. We have a particular equipment called tree core. I'm going to take my pointer so that I can show it to you, right? In this picture, we are looking at a tree core, right? So that particular tree core actually is some, imagine that as a large needle that you can drill entirely across the diameter of the tree, right? And take out a small sample of that particular tree, which looks like this, right? In that one, you can actually still see different tree rings, and you can still count the number of tree rings and see the different widths of each tree ring. And so that particular sample is no different from actually looking at a cross section. So you get the same amount of information and can reach conclusions regarding the tree's climate's history. There are better ways to do that. It is actually based on a technique known as radiometric dating of radioactive isotopes in different layers of the earth, in different sedimentary rocks. So what the actual techniques used for dating is quite complicated, so I am not going to cover that, but I'm going to kind of dumb it down for you. Um, so what happens over here is, you have to target, specifically focus on radioactive elements. One of the most popularly used one is carbon, right? Carbon has different molecular weights, right? The most common one is C12, and another one, or the second most abundant one, is C14. And now that form of carbon is radioactive. So over years, it starts decaying, right? And ultimately, C14 becomes actually some form of a nitrogen. So, and we know how long it takes for these radioactive isotopic elements to decay into something else. So the time it takes for carbon to become nitrogen, for C14 to become nitrogen, is about 5,700 years. So from a particular sample, soil or from a sedimentary rock by measuring the ratio between C14 and C12, right? You can actually estimate how much C14 were originally there, right? And then extrapolate that measurement into how much radioactive isotopes could have been there, and then use that information to backtrack how old that particular sample was, right? And of course, whenever you excavate a particular fossil, you know you're exactly doing the same. You're actually dating the sediments around the fossil or the fossil itself, right? And then that helps you to detect the time, and then by that time you also will know what kind of organisms lived in that particular environment. Speaking of organisms or fossils, you know all about the fossils, right? Um, but what you may not know is actually certain microorganisms such as diatoms and pollen that are actually very resistant to natural decay, right, will be preserved, as fossils, right? So preserving a vertebrate fossil is a very rare phenomena. It actually requires many environmental conditions to perfectly preserve a particular fossil. But microorganisms such as diatoms and pollen do not undergo regular decomposition because of the certain materials in them, such as lignin or silica, that prevents microbial decomposition. So those actually live forever. So um, certain microorganisms, certain diatoms are very habitat specific, right? There's habitat specialists, meaning like they can only occupy in certain type of habitats, right? Certain diatoms only occur in freshwater habitats, certain diatoms only in marine habitats, certain diatoms in brackish water habitats, right? Certain pollen, comes from a particular plant that can grow only in wetland conditions or only in dry conditions. So by extracting this microscopic biological evidence, you can actually understand what organisms lived, in that particular time frame. So that also helps you to infer the biota or the community that occupied X number of years ago. Now, how do you know X number of years? Again, you date through radiometric techniques. You date how old a particular sample was. Another technique that can be used to study the ancient climate is ice core sampling. Now, what is ice core sampling? Well, in parts of the earth like polar regions or mountain tops, those areas actually are filled with snow, right? So when snow deposits, right, on this earth surface, that creates tiny air pockets inside accumulating snow, right? So if you can actually drill into deeper layers of snow and kind of extract an undisturbed, unbroken pocket of air, now that air sample is indicative or it resembles the actual atmospheric composition. So you can actually using those air samples um, that are trapped within ice or trapped within snow, you can actually infer the constituents of the historic atmosphere, right? um, so that's actually how you know the relative carbon dioxide concentrations centuries ago, right? So another really useful technique to determine the ancient climate. And the depth of the snow indicates how old that particular atmosphere is. And within the atmospheric bubble, you can also sample for or survey for uh, isotopes. And then with that isotope composition, you can also infer the age of that particular tiny pocket of air that was trapped in the atmosphere, that was trapped within the deep layers of ice and snow. So there are many ways you can actually understand the ancient climate. So let's talk about now a the little bit about the Earth's climatic history, particularly with respect to changes in average global sea surface temperature. Now, in this graph on x-axis, you are looking at the time in thousands of years ago, and then on the y-axis, you are looking at average sea surface temperature. So what you see is, like kind of a roughly you can see very clear up and down fluctuations of temperature. And that particular up and down pattern, sinus pattern, is almost predictable, right? So the reason for this is actually the Earth's climatic past have undergone um, repeated cycles of glacial and interglacial cycles, right? And glacial cycles correspond to time frames where the sea surface temperature was extremely low, which resulted in development of massive sheets of ice over land as well as over the oceans, which actually created land bridges because of the freezing, because certain parts of the oceans gotten frozen, right? And so this led to formation of large oceanic ice sheets, glacier formation, um, and extremely frigid climates all over the planet Earth. And a glacial period lasts uh, on average about 70,000 to 90,000 years. In certain cases, little over that. And then between two ice ages or between two glacial periods, you have something called an interglacial period, right? Um, so those interglacial periods are relatively warmer, right? So if you look at the graph again, these dips you see, right, or the values you see in this figure corresponds to glacial periods corresponding to a significant drop in temperature. Those peaks in the graph you see corresponds to interglacial periods indicating significant increment in the sea surface temperature. So those in between glacial periods are known as interglacial periods, right? So an interglacial period lasts about 10,000 years. And so there is a very clear repeating pattern of glacial and interglacial periods throughout the history of the Earth's climate. Now, yeah, those are the glacial periods, and that's the interglacial period. Now, now let's take a look at kind of a smaller time frame, right? From now to the last 20,000 years. And what you can see is actually at the around last 20,000 to 10,000 years ago, in this particular time frame, right, that reflects towards the edge of the last ice age, which belongs to the Pleistocene era, and the Pleistocene era started 2.6 million years ago and ended about 11,700 years ago. And the last ice age lasted not throughout the Pleistocene era; it lasted little over 9,000 years ago. In fact, somewhere around 100,000 years ago, and and this particular low temperature part corresponds to that particular the tail end of the last ice age. And then after that, what we are seeing is actually a rapid increment in the temperature, which is not surprising because after a glacial period, what you are going to get is an interglacial period. But what is happening right now is actually we do not see the interglacial period receding into another glacial period. Okay? So what you see is sustained temperature, right? You can see temperature being sustained um, at a very high level all the way up to the modern day. In fact, right now, if you look at this particular corner, right, you do see evidence on the modern day within the last few decades that the sea surface temperature is actually increasing. So, and in fact, if you just zoom into, like I just mentioned, the last 130 years, you clearly see that the sea surface temperature is actually not stable, right? It's actually increasing, right? So this graph on the graph on the bottom um, does not show the trends in the last few centuries, but here it's actually a better because you have kind of zoom into a very smaller scale in the x-axis and kind of like zoom it out. So in that one, there's a clear trend of increasing sea surface temperatures. And in the recent more decades, that increase is much more dramatic than what it was in early 1800s or 1900s. Um, so, and if you kind of looked into the trend within the past 1,000 years, again, you clearly see um, that particular peak, which corresponds to the modern day warming. This is actually why the global warming is much more dramatic, because the global warming that we observe is not simply um, reflective of any glacial period. The sea surface temperature now overshoots what we would anticipated by an interglacial period. Because of that, because of the greater temperature we are observing and sustained temperature, which is projected to keep increasing, right? We consider the modern era as a super interglacial period. Now, the same time, if you look at the within the last 1,000 years, you still do see a couple of dips and peaks in the temperature curve, right? I want to mention a couple of periods within that last 10,000 years or so. One is actually called the Little Ice Age, which kind of happens between 1300s to 1400s. Actually, 1300 to 1500s, where the effect of which is more prominent in the northern hemisphere. And during this period, actually, we do have evidence for accumulation of glaciers in certain mountain ranges. And then subsequently, we also have evidence for another localized or regional warming on the planet, um, which is known as the medieval warming period. So there has been smaller fluctuations within the sea surface temperature, which is more prominent at regional scale, not at global scale. But the global warming phenomena that we are discussing about um, goes above and beyond these tiny dips and valleys that happens within the last 1,000 years, right? In terms of its extent of impact, as well as the actual change in the sea surface temperature. So, like I mentioned, the Little Ice Age happened about between 1300 to 1400 years. So, how do we know that the sea surface temperatures corresponds with increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations? Well, this graph actually answers that particular question. The graph in its x-axis shows years from 1880 to late 2000s, and then on the there are two y-axes, right? One y-axis is the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. The other one is the temperature. So the red line is kind of the smooth line, the smoothened curve of average sea surface temperatures. The orange line is the annual average temperature points. And then the black line is the carbon dioxide concentrations. We can clearly see that all the curves, the temperature curve is superimposing on the carbon dioxide curve. So the idea is actually there is really good correspondence. Did the carbon dioxide concentration increase within this time frame? Yes, we do have evidence for that. In fact, after 1940s, the increment of global carbon dioxide concentrations are exponential. And well, what happened to the temperature? Well, we do see that slower increments or up and downs in temperature between 1800s to 1940, but after that we see a rapid increment in the temperature as well. So there is very good correspondence between increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations and increasing temperatures. So now what drives global climate change? In other words, what's the key underlying climatic variable that affects all phenomena related to global climate change? Well, it is the atmospheric temperature, to be precise, the sea surface temperature, the thing that we have been demonstrating to you thus far. So it is actually the term global warming actually corresponds to this increase in average sea surface temperature, right? So it is in fact this increment in the global average sea surface temperature that actually leads to all the major changes in the climate, meaning um, certain while global warming is happening, can certain parts of the earth could become extremely cold while other parts become extremely warm? Absolutely, right? Global warming does not indicate or does not mean that every inch of the earth is increasing in temperature. No, that's not what it means. It does not mean that that the winter is shortening all over the world. No, it does not mean there's going to be drought all over the world. No, again, global warming means increment in sea surface temperatures, increment in average sea surface temperatures, right? And which then actually creates a differential surface temperatures, leads to different pressure points across the earth. And when you have different pressure points, actually creates new wind patterns, new oceanic currents, and that oceanic currents and wind patterns results in different types of atmospheric conditions, different types of seasonal changes, um, and which then subsequently leads to different types of changes in the climate that has not been foreseen before. Now in this graph, we are again looking at on y-axis of temperature anomaly. Temperature anomaly means variation of the temperatures, variation or the deviation from the average temperatures, right? And then on x-axis, you are looking at the time. Um, so there are different curves in this graph. So those different curves for temperature anomalies or temperature abnormalities or temperature deviations comes from different sources. One data set comes from NASA, another data set from World Met Office, the Meteorological Organization, another from NOAA, National Oceanic and Aeronautical Administration, and the third one is actually from Japanese Met Department, right? So from different, so here you are looking at different sets of data coming from completely independent organizations, but the temperature anomalies they calculate from 1880 to post 2000s superimposed on each other. So do we have a disagreement on global warming? Actually, we do not. We have agreement on global warming, right? Independent organizations collecting data on the same phenomena, reporting exactly the same thing. So um, we have more evidence, in support of climate change. So in this slide, what we are trying to show you is actually how sea surface temperatures have been changing from 1880 to 2012, right? So in the image, in the map, right, you do see the remarkable appearance of this yellow to red patterns. So yellow to red colorations so indicates warming, right, and the blue coloration indicates like cooling, right. We do see, this dark red spots coming up, and a few minutes back, you saw those spots coming back all across Antarctica, and previously you did notice that certain red spots occurring towards the northern latitudes, and now you see, as the time progresses, a remarkable degree of warming happening, at continental scale, right? By 2012, you can see, like, most of the spots are actually warming up. Only a few spots are actually cooling down. So it's kind of a really cool animation to understand over the years how the global sea surface temperature changed over the time. So this figure shows couple of other greenhouse gases with carbon dioxide and shows how it changes over the time. And now we can see, if you look into the past 2000 years, the concentration of nitrogen oxides, carbon dioxide, and methane remain quite lower, right? Way below 300 parts per million, right? But ppm parts per million, ppb parts per billion, right? Two different ways to measure concentrations. Um, they were relatively lower, and we do see that still carbon dioxide has the highest concentrations, methane the lowest, and nitrogen oxides kind of fluctuates in between. But after or closer to 2000, somewhere around mid 1900s, all three greenhouse gases started increasing in their concentrations, right? So actually that led to human enhanced greenhouse effect. So like I mentioned several times earlier, now um, the re-radiation of infrared that is emitting from the heated surface, is now trapped, right, and re-emitted back to the surface, right? And that increased greenhouse gases will actually trap extra heat, and that will result in warming of the atmosphere. So what led to increasing in the greenhouse gases? Well, one thing that happened within this past 1900s, well, when exactly, um, this happened depending on when industrial revolution took place, because it's not exactly on the same time in different parts of the world. So industrial development or industrial revolution is a primary driver of increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So largely this happens after 1900s. Mostly on average it's somewhere between 1930s to 1950s would be a good ballpark. And during this time, what happened? Well, fossil fuel consumption of burning fossil fuel to run automobiles, to run factories, and secondarily, removal of carbon sinks through deforestation. Right? Forests, natural vegetation in general, are well equipped to absorb carbon dioxide for the purpose of photosynthesis, and because it absorbs atmospheric carbon dioxide, natural vegetation is considered a carbon sink, right? And other forms of land use land cover change other than deforestation, like development of farmlands, development of industrial areas, development of residential areas, all of those actually resulted in loss of natural vegetation cover, loss of wetland cover, and wetlands are also a great source of carbon dioxide removal, a great a very effective carbon sink. um, and then other practices like paddy fields and certain forms of animal farming led to increased emissions of methane, and certain types of wetland drainage exposed partially decomposed organic matter or peat to the atmosphere, and subsequently this exposed peat undergoes oxidation and releases more carbon dioxide, contributing more towards greenhouse green, contributing more towards trapping solar radiation. And then and also interestingly enough, in polar regions, snow cover itself prevents oxidation of heat, oxidation of partially decomposed organic matter. Um, but when the snow cover disappears, when the snow cover retreats, it also releases methane and carbon dioxide that was trapped underneath the snow cover, again contributing towards um, increased trapping of heat. So currently, we are experiencing within the last century, the sea surface temperature on average has increased at least by zero point 0.7 degrees Celsius, right? And now this measurement is an average one, right? So this is much higher in the polar region. Actually, certain calculation suggests it could be between 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The increment is 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius in polar regions. On average, it's about 0.7 degrees Celsius. And that number, the anomaly, will only keep getting worse, if we do not, if the carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase in the way it does right now.